Welcome to the third session of the fourth annual multidisciplinary conference of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at William Paterson University of New Jersey, entitled Us and Them, The Paradox of Difference and Inequality in a Global Age. I want to first begin by acknowledging and thanking the conference co-sponsors, which are listed in your conference program. We would also like to acknowledge and thank the conference committee members, also listed in the program, as well as the staff of the Dean's Office, the broadcast production and support team, and hospitality service, who have all worked really hard to make this conference go as well as it has. Before beginning the session, I ask if you would please silence your cell phones. I also ask that you refrain from taking any photographs and making any audio or video recordings while the session is in progress. At this time, I would like to invite Provost Warren Sandman to come forward to provide a formal university welcome and to officially open the session. Provost Sandman.
Well, good afternoon and welcome here to this session. As Professor Reby noted, this is the third session in today's conference. And just like he did, I want to start by thanking everyone who's helped make this possible here. The committee members, Dean Rabbit, Associate Dean Martina Davis, all the people who did all the work to put this together, including the people who put all the chairs in this room and the people who made sure that everything's working up here for the equipment. The amount of work that goes into putting together a successful conference, people don't always realize what has to happen to make this happen. And this works so well and so smoothly, so just thank you and congratulations on that. As Professor Reby noted, this is the fourth annual conference here. And the College of Humanities and Social Sciences has developed and turned this into a program that truly is a unique experience for our students here at William Paterson, for community members who wish to take part in this. We have brought forward, and we'll bring forward again today, some fantastic speakers who will give you some information that you're not going to get otherwise. It's a great opportunity. And for some reason, whether it's purely their intelligence and experience, or maybe a little bit of luck as well too, the conference organizers once again have brought forward an extremely timely and relevant topic to take a look at here. You can't avoid hearing what's going on and what we're going to talk about today by following what's going on in politics, in our presidential campaigns, in what's happening on campuses here. If you saw the news the other day, a university president removed from campus for failure to deal with some of these issues we're going to talk about today. So extremely timely and relevant issues that we're going to be looking at here. As we think about this, and we think about what it means to be the other, and we're going to hear about that a little bit today. Some people have said and made an argument that because of who we are as a people, because we've made so many different strides, we've become more diverse, we've become more welcoming, the idea that there is the other out there, that concept doesn't matter anymore. But that's not true. For all the advances we make, for everything we do, for every celebration we have about how we become a more diverse, a more multicultural, more welcoming, more tolerant society, there's always a pushback. For every action, there's a reaction. For everything we move forward, there seems to be a step that people want to move back as well too. So this idea and to think about what the other means and how we fear, how we think, how we respond to this concept, I think is really important here. So I'm looking forward very much to hear from our speakers today. And I also look forward, as I always do, some really good questions from the audience here following our presentations. So welcome. Thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to this afternoon.
Thank you, Provost Sandman. Session 3 is titled Fearing Difference, Terror and the Other. Since 9/11, our society has struggled with the protection of national security and the tension that goes with protecting civil and political rights at the same time. During this period, we have seen a rise in anti-Muslim sentiment, most of which is based on negative stereotypes, resulting in bias, discrimination, and the exclusion of Muslims from social, political, and civic life. This sentiment has become even more pervasive in the legal system, where the protection of civil rights has been sacrificed far too often in the interests of national security. Our distinguished panelists here to speak to these larger issues include Dr. Jeanne Theoharis from Brooklyn College of the City University of New York and Dr. Arun Kundnani from New York University. I'm going to first introduce Dr. Jeanne Theoharis. The title of her talk is Civil Rights in Crisis in Post 9/11 America. Dr. Jeanne Theoharis is a distinguished professor of political science at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. She is the author or co-author of 7 books and dozens of articles on the Black freedom struggle in 20th century America and the contemporary politics of race and inequality in schools, social policy, and the post 9/11 justice system. Her biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, has garnered widespread acclaim and numerous awards, including a 2014 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work, Biography, Autobiography, and the Letitia Woods Brown Award from the Association of Black Women Historians. She co-curates a monthly public education series at the Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture of the NYPL entitled Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. She is co-founder of Educators for Civil Liberties. She has written extensively on civil and human rights issues in the federal system post 9/11 in The Nation, The Chronicle of Higher Education, Slate, The Progressive, and the American University Law Review. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeanne Theoharis.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you for this day that is sort of, I think, blending, 3 different kind of justice and injustice systems, right? As we think about immigration, as we think about more traditional criminal justice, and then what's happened in post 9/11 America. So I actually want to tell 2 very personal stories today. Stories of 2 students to help us think about civil rights in post 9/11 America, and in particular to think about the evisceration of civil rights in post 9/11 America. And in many ways, before I tell you these 2 stories, this is really a story of the law, of how the law has changed, expanded, shifted over the past 50 years, and then in particular over the past 15 to 20 years. So beginning in the 1960s, I think as many of you know, and expanding in the 1980s and 90s, the United States became a drastically more punitive society. I think most of us are familiar with the statistics, so about 300,000 people are incarcerated in 1970, almost 2.5 million today. So to do that, prosecutors, the police, and prison guards were given increasingly more latitude to do what they needed to do to protect society. So that's kind of the first trend, bigger trend in the law. Now, this more specific trend that really is going to intersect with the stories I'm telling today begins actually before 9/11, during Bill Clinton's presidency, in part as a reaction to the first World Trade Center incident, which is that the public and President Clinton and political leaders began to change the way they thought about criminal justice vis-a-vis terrorism, and in particular, the concept of a preemptive prosecution, that you were to stop crimes even before they started. And this sounds good in some sort of CSI kind of way, but in many ways, it overturns the basic assumption of US criminal justice law, which is that you are prosecuting a crime or a formed conspiracy to commit a crime. And so in order to do that, they needed new laws. And in particular, one new law that comes on the books in 1996 is the law banning material support to terrorism. Now, again, on the face of it, that sounds very scary, right? It sounds like guns, it sounds like money. But in fact, material support criminalized a whole variety of behavior, including expertise, including any kinds of knowledge, legitimacy, as well as actual material goods. And so that is instituted under Bill Clinton, and it is expanded under George Bush in the wake of 9/11 and kept in place under President Obama. And so in many ways, material support allowed the criminalizing of what many legal scholars will call pre-crime, crime that hasn't been committed, crime in absence of a defined plot. And so the key in order to do this was to develop a set of theories in order to sort of catch these pre-criminals. And we're going to be talking about that today. I'm going to be talking about that, and Arun is going to be talking about that as well. How do you then catch people who haven't actually sort of committed a crime? And various sort of legal theories start to kind of take hold in the law enforcement community, both locally in the NYPD and the FBI, around theories of radicalization. And so in many ways, this paradox is sort of at the essence of what I'm going to talk about today. The paradox that the law has been a key tool in the denial and abridgment of civil rights, right? Now that seems a little weird on the face of it, because in many ways we always think of the law as a protector of civil rights, right? We think of the First Amendment, we think of the Bill of Rights. But in many ways, as we think back over American history, the law has also, since the beginning of the United States, been a key tool to abridge and deny civil rights. If we think about slavery and the sort of stripping of Native American land, if we think about Japanese internment, if we think about Jim Crow segregation, if we think about McCarthyism, if we think about mass incarceration, all of these civil rights abridging moments in American history actually were accomplished through the law. And so one of the things that I wanted to think about, and we can return to more in the question and answer, is thinking about the law. Because I think one of the reigning myths of post 9/11 America, if you hear somebody say civil liberties in post 9/11 America, what do most of us think? We think the prison at Guantanamo Bay, right? That's sort of the first thing that comes to our mind for very good reason. But I think part of what's been missed in that is thinking about what's happened domestically in the law here at home. That at the same time these abuses are happening outside the law, there has been a sort of corresponding problem happening within the law. So again, I want to tell you two stories of two students. The first student was a student I had in 2002, and his name was Fahad Hashmi, and he took my senior seminar. I'm in a political science department, and I teach a senior seminar. Every senior at Brooklyn College takes a seminar and writes a research paper in their senior year. And so Fahad took my senior seminar. It was on civil rights, and he decided to write his research paper. This was the spring of 2002. This was right after 9/11. He was a very politically active, very devout Muslim student, and he decided to write his research paper on what Muslims were facing in the wake of 9/11, and in particular, the treatment of Muslim groups of various political persuasions. So I say yes, he writes this paper, he comes back the next semester and he says, I want to go to a master's program. He was very interested in political Islam. He decided to apply to master's programs in the UK. I wrote him a letter of recommendation, and like with many students, I send him on his way. Fast forward 3 years, and the top of the evening news, a homegrown terrorist has been arrested at Heathrow Airport. Material support to terrorism, Al-Qaeda quartermaster, military guilt to Al-Qaeda. This was the top of the news. And I remember standing in the hall at work, talking to some of my colleagues who had also had him, and my chair comes along, and she says to us, we've been instructed not to say anything, so don't say anything. And I think that's a message, and I think we can go back to that in the Q&A. I think that's been a message that we've gotten over and over and since 9/11, the kind of we've been instructed not to say anything. So I sort of put the case out of my head. And as it turns out, he fights his extradition. He's a U.S. citizen, but he doesn't want to be extradited back to the United States because he's fearing what's going to happen to him here. He loses that in part because he is a U.S. citizen, and he's brought back to the United States and held in New York City, in Lower Manhattan, at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. And a colleague says to me, now this is a year after this has happened, do you know what happened to him? And that question stuck in my head. Because he had been, as I mentioned, a very politically active student. He had been a very religious student. And I am a scholar of African American history, and as I was just mentioning, one of the things that I started to think about is this kind of history of the way that politically active, that dissent is often policed in times of crisis and in times of war. And so I went and I called his lawyer, and that story, that evening news story, when you start to poke down on it, looked a lot different once you sort of got outside that headline. So he had been arrested, as I told you, for material support to terrorism, for quote-unquote military gear to Al-Qaeda. That's what the news said. As I started to talk to his lawyer, what became clear is that the charges he was facing was, in fact, for letting a friend from New York stay with him in his student apartment in London for 2 weeks. The friend came to visit. The friend had raincoats, ponchos, and waterproof socks that the friend later allegedly delivered to an Al-Qaeda leader in Pakistan. That friend was arrested and agreed to cooperate and was giving testimony in a number of cases. And so that friend was actually now free. And so these were the charges. And Fouad was being held in Lower Manhattan in the MCC in solitary confinement under a particularly isolating regime of solitary confinement called SAMs, or Special Administrative Measures. Now that sounds boring and bureaucratic, but in fact what it meant was not only was he in solitary confinement, but his communication with the outside world was completely restricted. He was allowed to talk to his lawyer, and he was allowed to talk to his parents, and that was it. He was not allowed to write letters to anyone, get letters from anyone, and his news was restricted. He was only allowed the newspaper after a 30-day delay, and they would take all news of the Muslim world out of his newspaper. He didn't have a radio. He didn't have a television. He couldn't go outside. He didn't have any direct sunlight coming in his window. And he spent 3 years like this, in pretrial solitary confinement under this kind of isolation. And as I mentioned, he is a US citizen, but he was facing evidence that had been classified under something called SIPA. Now, SIPA was started in the 1980s, and it was started for a completely different reason. It was started because the United States was trying to prosecute people in the CIA who were spying for Russia. And so and one of the ways that it made it hard to prosecute those spies was they would often reveal or threaten to reveal classified evidence. So in 1981, this new law was put on the books that they could classify evidence in certain trials, right? If the person was threatening to reveal classified evidence. Now fast forward 20 years and that law shifts totally. So it used to be that it was preventing someone who had classified evidence from releasing it. What it's being used as now is to prevent the classified evidence that the government deems classified from being shared with the defense, and particularly with the defendant himself. So that sounds all dense and sort of political, but what it means at base is that he was facing evidence that he couldn't see. So again, if we're thinking about civil rights, here we have first that he was being kept in years of pretrial solitary confinement, what the international community considers torture. He was facing evidence he couldn't see. And key to the prosecution was evidence that they were going to bring in of his political activities as a college student. Speeches he'd given, activities he'd engaged in at Brooklyn College. He was very critical of the United States. He called the United States a terrorist. So his political activities were becoming part of the prosecution as well. A movement started to grow around his case that was used as further evidence of his danger. And then one day before trial, again, after 3 years of solitary confinement, he took a government plea bargain on one count. He was sent to the Supermax prison in Colorado, which has been in the news recently, right? It is the most severe prison in the federal system. He was last year transferred out of that prison to a prison in Indiana, and he is still in prison. So I tell you that story because, again, it is a story of headlines, but it's also a story of what it looks like underneath the headline. Because if you'd seen that headline when that story broke in 2006, right, it was a scary, scary story. What it looked like on the face of it, right, was a homegrown terrorist who was trying to take military gears for Al-Qaeda. And again, I think partly because of this mythology about the law, we have not asked questions, and so those stories, we tend to sort of take them in. And again, this story is a lot like other stories. So again, every couple weeks we hear of arrests, of material support to ISIS, of people trying to help this and that. And there's very little follow-up after those stories. Those stories are typically based on the government's indictment, their press release when they indict someone, and then the media attention around those cases tends to then disappear. So that's the first story I want us to think about. Now, the second story I want us to think about is actually a more recent story. We're going to fast forward 10 years, and I have another student. And I'm going to call this student Fatma. So many of you may remember in 2011, the Associated Press broke a series of stories showing that the NYPD was surveilling Muslim communities both in New York and in New Jersey. Do people remember that? A little bit, yeah. Right, they broke story after story sort of all across the fall and the winter. They won a Pulitzer Prize for those stories, showing that, in fact, the NYPD was sitting in restaurants and bookstores, infiltrating mosques, infiltrating Muslim student associations across the metro area, right? That it was this widespread blanket surveillance of Muslim communities. And including the Muslim student associations at CUNY, and as the news came out, including putting informants in a number of Muslim student associations at CUNY, including the Student Association at Brooklyn College. So the next year, I had a student, Fatma, I'm calling her, and she did her senior thesis on the effect of of growing up amidst this surveillance. And she wrote her senior thesis on using Foucault's idea of the Panopticon. Have you studied the Panopticon? Yes, no? So the Panopticon, Jean-Michel Foucault is a sort of political social theorist, and he talked about this way of policing a prison, whereby you erect a tower that can see the whole prison or the whole prison yard, and you can't tell if anybody's in the tower. And so what starts to happen is that you take the policing into yourself, and you don't know when there's somebody up there, and so you start to police yourself. And so she writes this brilliant senior thesis on that idea of the Panopticon and how knowing you're being policed changes. It changes how you talk in class. It changes how you are friends. It changes what groups you belong to. It changes how you pray. It changes how you move through the city. And so she also graduates, and she goes on, and she's studying at Columbia right now, doing her graduate work at Columbia right now. And I don't know if people saw the story in Gothamist last week, but Gothamist published a story that showed that for the past 4 years, an undercover cop had been placed in the Muslim Student Association at Brooklyn College, a woman undercover cop that kind of wormed her way into the friendships and political activities and religious activities of many, many students across New York, not just at Brooklyn, but into the lives of many women Brooklyn College students as well. And that undercover cop was on campus since 2011. And so here we have, again, sort of the academic not being so academic, in that here, similar to Fahad, he wrote this paper, and then here it was not so academic anymore. With Fatma here, she and I had spent this whole year talking about and thinking about and writing about the effects of surveillance on Muslim students. And here, right alongside when she was doing that work with me, an undercover cop was befriending her and her friends, hanging out with them, getting herself invited to events, getting herself asked to be a bridesmaid in one of her friends' weddings, right? Just basically infiltrating herself into the lives of sort of these young people at Brooklyn College, but also other Muslim young people across the city. And part of why I decided to tell you these two stories is because I think sometimes when we talk about 9/11 and we talk about the war on terror and we talk about civil liberties, it seems very abstract and it seems very far away. And I think part of what I think these stories show is again, the real personal side, right? And what the civil rights abuses look like on a personal level, right? And so on the one hand, we have Fahad's case and sort of terrorism prosecutions and the kind of civil rights abuses happening in those terrorism prosecutions. And on the other side, we have Fatma and her friends, and the civil rights abuses of having this kind of intrusive, invasive law, like surveillance and police spying. And so I guess I wanted to finish by kind of suggesting a few reasons why it's been hard to see these civil rights issues, why we haven't been having, why we aren't yet having a national conversation about this, and I think we need to be having a national conversation about this. I think similar to Japanese internment, when we look back on this period in 50 years, this is going to be seen as one of the kind of key civil rights crises of our time. But I think in the moment, similarly to the moment with internment, to the moment with McCarthyism, danger is often portrayed as unique danger. It's uniquely dangerous, therefore you need unique tools to combat it. And that was the argument in 1941, and that was the argument in 1950, and that is again the argument today. And I think what's slippery about that is just because it's unique or different doesn't mean the whole point of the Constitution, right, was to prevent unique circumstances from trumping the rights, right? And I think we need to kind of be mindful of that. I think the second thing, and this is where I started my talk, is this question of the law and the paradox of the law. And the way that when we think about the law, we think about the law as a tool for civil rights. And I think we need to be having a conversation about the law as a tool for abridging civil rights as well. And again, I think this picks up on the conversation if people were here for the morning talks. I think the third of these rationalizations that we sometimes hear, the sort of, what do you have to hide? And I think this is particularly often something that is said around surveillance, right? Well, so why? So what does it matter, right? If you have nothing to hide. But again, I think if we think about what it means, both on a personal level, but also I think I'm always reminded, I am first a scholar of African American history. And during the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King was surveilled massively by the FBI on the grounds that he was a potential communist or had communists in his inner circle. And he didn't. But because they were surveilling him all the time, they discovered that Martin Luther King was having affairs. Now, that didn't have anything to do with national security. It didn't harm the United States at all. But once the FBI found that out, they tried to use it to discredit him. And so I guess one of the questions when people say, what do people have to hide? I think most of us have something to hide. Most of us are not perfect in every moment of our lives. Some of us speed. Some of us smoke pot. Some of us take shortcuts on our taxes. Some of us have affairs. Some of us do things we're not proud of, right? So I think one of the things about surveillance is what do you have to hide means do you have anything? Have you been perfect every single second, right? Because it doesn't have to do with national security for it to be something that could be used, again, like with Martin Luther King. I think the fourth is, again, something that I've seen in the past couple years as the revelations from Edward Snowden's files have come forward, and this sense that all Americans are being surveilled, that all of our cell phones are being surveilled, that all of our emails being surveilled. And I think that's very troubling. But I think one of the things that we've forgotten in that conversation is that some of us are being surveilled more. That the cost for some of us is much higher than for others. And I think we need to be honest about that. And I think the final thing, and I think the final danger, and the final thing I think we need to be mindful of is this problem of the way that post 9/11 civil liberties have been talked about as a problem outside of the United States, as a problem of taking it outside the law, of the way that Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib or Bagram exist beyond the reach of the law. And I think we're having finally a public conversation, in part inspired by Black Lives Matter, about the problems within the law, but we haven't taken those questions and those insights and looked at it in other realms, including kind of post 9/11 justice. And so I guess the last point I would like to make, which I think is what this conference is trying to do, is to sort of the danger of siloing these issues and the need to put these issues together. So I think I'll stop there. We can have time for more questions, and I can obviously expand on these stories. I've obviously told them very quickly, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Theoharis. Our next panelist is Dr. Arun Kundnani. The title of his presentation is "The Muslims Are Coming: Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror." The Guardian has described Dr. Kundnani as one of Britain's best political writers. His latest book, The Muslims Are Coming, was published by Verso Books in 2014. He was born and bred in London. He moved to New York in 2010 on a fellowship with the Open Society Foundations and now lives in Harlem. He's the author of The End of Tolerance, Racism in 21st Century Britain, which was selected as a New Statesman Book of the Year in 2007. He's a former editor of the journal Race and Class. He was educated at Cambridge University, holds a PhD from London Metropolitan University, and now teaches at New York University. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Arun Kundnani.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to speak about these issues. There is a conventional narrative that keeps popping up when we think about what we call post 9/11 question of civil liberties, right? And this conventional narrative goes something like this. 9/11 happened, it's a traumatic event for the nation. As a kind of reaction to that, we have had to struggle with a number of issues. One of those is how do we balance national security with civil liberties, right? And the other is in this environment post 9/11, we have a problem of rising anti-Muslim prejudice, right? That's the conventional way in which we try and come at these issues, and kind of we all kind of keep framing things in that way. Jeanne Theoharis has given us one strand to why that way of framing things doesn't work, right? Which is that when you pose the question of how do you balance national security with civil liberties, what you don't see is what that means for people's lives who are having their civil liberties taken away. And the abstract debate about this balancing doesn't really allow you to capture that experience, right? Which we started to get a bit of a sense of from Professor Theoharis. I'm going to come at questioning that conventional narrative from a different angle, right? Because the weird thing about this is 9/11 is actually not where anti-Muslim prejudice comes from, right? We keep saying it does, but it doesn't. It precedes 9/11 by quite a lot of time. If you want to put a starting point on where this kind of pattern of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism begins in the United States, a much more sensible starting point would be the early 1970s, right? When you start to see the stereotypes that are now very prevalent, you start to see those stereotypes circulating then, right? This is not about a temporary overreaction to an emergency situation like 9/11, right? A national security emergency. That is not what this is about. We like to think that this is, this is somehow us getting a little bit carried away with ourselves, understandably, after a traumatic incident, right? And over a few years, we'll kind of readjust to a more balanced approach to thinking about the position of Muslims in American society. It's 14 years now, right? And we are not, the further we get away from 9/11, we are not moving to a time when that rebalancing, if that's what we're heading for, is happening. In fact, if you look over the last few years, the question of anti-Muslim racism has, if anything, become worse. Particularly over the last 6 years, you've seen a kind of a new discourse, a new fear, that the idea that Muslims are somehow infiltrating themselves into the United States systems of government and taking over the country and imposing Sharia law, right? This kind of weird belief has become mainstream just in the last few years. In 2011, Republican Congressman Alan West called Islam a fifth column that's infiltrated United States institutions. 2010 speech by Newt Gingrich, he talks about Sharia law as a mortal threat to the survival of freedom in the United States. Herman Cain, remember him from the Republican primaries a few years ago. He talks about the attempt to gradually ease Sharia law and the Muslim faith into our government, and said he would introduce a special loyalty test for Muslims wanting to serve in his administration. Michelle Bachmann, a US representative, declared that Sharia must be resisted across the United States and demanded a special investigation into so-called infiltration of the federal government by the Muslim Brotherhood. Right? So these are paranoid fears that we have that lack any basis in reality. Nevertheless, they are becoming mainstream. We've seen it in the last few weeks in the Republican presidential field again, with Donald Trump and Ben Carson both making anti-Muslim comments. On Meet the Press, Carson said, "I would not advocate that we put a Muslim in charge of this nation. I absolutely would not agree with that." A few days earlier, there was a question and answer session at a New Hampshire campaign rally, and a Donald Trump supporter said, "We have a problem in this country, it's called Muslims," and Trump nodded in response. So a recent poll found that only around half of Republicans think that Islam should be legal in the United States. 43% of Republicans believe Obama is a Muslim. And as I say, this kind of rhetoric really has only got going in this form in the last few years. It's not about 9/11, right? Beyond the headlines that you get when these comments are made, there is an organised and well-funded propaganda campaign. Something like $40 to $100 million has been spent on anti-Muslim propaganda between 2001 and 2009. The aim of that propaganda is pretty clear. It's to mainstream a kind of conspiracy theory that in its structure is very similar to the kinds of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that were circulated a century ago. When you look at the situation a century ago, America's Jews were also seen as infiltrators into this country, seen as threatening Western values. And central to that anti-Semitism was a conspiracy theory that presented Jews as secretly controlling the banks and the government through a hidden conspiracy. Henry Ford, for example, used the pages of a newspaper that he owned in Michigan called the Dearborn Independent to promote those views in the 1920s, right? The current conspiracy theory that Muslims are infiltrating the government, that they secretly control the government, is exactly the same in structure, right? The idea that Obama is a Muslim secretly working for the Muslim Brotherhood is exactly the same as those old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Now, why conspiracy theory? Well, if you want to understand this, you have to understand a little more about how racism works. So the first thing to understand is that racism, Islamophobia, is not about hatred, right? We like to tell ourselves, again, it's another kind of stories that we like to tell ourselves, that what we're dealing with here is hateful individuals. What we're dealing with, we have this whole vocabulary that we use nowadays to think about race. Words like diversity, bias, tolerance. And we set up this idea that there are tolerant people and there are hateful people. And racism is essentially about individuals who have hateful prejudices or bias that they're unconscious of that gets expressed in various ways, right? It's all about individual attitudes, right? Interestingly, no one talked about race in this way until the last few decades. If you look at Martin Luther King's speeches, he never uses the word tolerance. He's not interested in tolerance. He's interested in equality, right? It's a different idea, right? We have simplified our understanding of race since that period. Martin Luther King understood that racism was about a system. It was about social structures, right? It wasn't about individual attitudes. When people in the 60s used the phrase institutional racism that I heard earlier today, they didn't just mean there's institutions that have racist prejudice among the individuals who work in that institution. They're talking about racism as a systematic structure in this society, right? That's what we need to understand about anti-Muslim racism as well. And if you want to have a society in which you have a racist ideology circulating, you don't make that happen by having individuals who are full of hatred. The way you make that happen is find a way to connect that racist ideology to people's personal frustrations and desires and the things that matter to them in their lives, right? Make racism the explanation that explains to them why they feel frustrated, right? Now, if you want to do that in the United States in the 21st century in relation to Muslims, you have a problem, right? Because it is completely implausible to blame Muslims in the United States for any of the national problems that we face, right? But if you're willing to invent a conspiracy theory and convince people of the truth of that conspiracy theory, then you can fix that problem. Because you can say, well, you don't know this, right? But the reason that the United States is failing to renew itself is because secretly the government's controlled by Muslims who are working against our national interests. Now you can explain anything by blaming it on Muslims, right? That's what this particular version of Islamophobia that we're currently dealing with is doing. And the fact that it's become mainstream in the same way that anti-Semitism was mainstream 100 years ago in the United States should be of incredible concern to us, because it legitimizes the kinds of criminalization of a community that Professor Theoharis was sharing with us. So, American Jews were, of course, eventually able to overcome the worst anti-Semitisms of the 20th century and establish relative security and equality in the United States. Unfortunately, I am less optimistic that we can just assume that that is the path that Muslims will be able to traverse over the coming decades. And the reason for that is that today, these this pattern of anti-Muslim sentiment is not. It's connected to a global story that didn't exist 100 years ago in relation to Jews, right? It's not just an irrational fear, it's a belief system that is linked to a whole global system of power, right? And that's what I'm gonna try and expand on with you in the rest of my time. Now, in 2011, I spent a year traveling around the United States trying to think about this question of Islamophobia for the book that Ryan mentioned. And at one point I was in a suburb of Houston, Texas, a neighborhood called Katy, and I came across an image that I think perfectly captures the nature of what we're dealing with here. So in a restaurant, there was a poster that was hanging on the wall that had been created by the owner of the restaurant. And it had in it a photograph of a lynching that had taken place in the early 20th century. So you see a tree, you see a dead body hanging from a branch, a crowd of people in the foreground looking jubilant. And where the original image would have had a black face of the victim, in the restaurant's version, superimposed on that was a kind of stereotypical image of an Arab. And the poster's caption read, "Let's play cowboys and Iranians." Of course, the person who did this doesn't really distinguish between Iranians and Arabs. So it's a disturbing image for two reasons. First, obviously, it's shocking to kind of go into a restaurant and see a kind of glorification of racist violence in this way. Especially because in the same neighborhood, I'd heard stories of teenagers being beaten up at school simply for being Arab, of mosque congregations being harassed, death threats against Muslims aired on local radio stations. But the other point that occurred to me was that the image in its own way is very revealing, because it demonstrates how anti-Muslim racism is best understood as part of a longer racial history in the United States. So think about the caption to the poster, obviously with its play on the phrase cowboys and Indians, implicit reference there to violence against America's indigenous peoples by European settlers, which is in a way the first act in the racial history of the United States. Then you have the lynching part of the image, which of course refers to the use of violence to uphold Jim Crow segregation. And then, as it were, the final layer on this racial history is anti-Muslim racism, right? So anti-Muslim racism then is like a kind of reworking and recycling of these older logics of oppression. And what that tells us is that when we think about Islamophobia or anti-Muslim prejudice, we shouldn't be thinking of this in terms of in terms of the individual perpetrators of those acts of violence. We should be thinking of this as the product of a much wider culture, a product of of a deeper structure in society, right? So when we look at the history here, I think we need to kind of learn some of the lessons of the past. So we do not need to kind of reinvent the wheel when we're thinking about this particular kind of racism, because we have in our history struggles and knowledge that has been built up over the last century in thinking about how racism works, right? And we can apply the same lessons from the past to this current set of problems. Martin Luther King, when I mentioned him earlier, the way he talks about racism, he understands that it is not only it's part of a social system, right, and that social system is also a system of war, right, outside the United States, and that the relationship between violence at home and violence overseas is integral to how we need to think about racism, right? The Vietnam War for him was not some separate issue from the civil rights movement. It was integral to it. You can't advocate for peace and anti-racism within the United States while turning a blind eye to peace and racism being perpetrated by the United States in other parts of the world. That's what Martin Luther King came to understand over the course of the 1960s when he took up the anti-Vietnam War movement as part of his work. We're in exactly the same situation today, right? What we're dealing with now is not just again, it's not just an exceptional period of time where we happen to be at war. We are permanently at war, and we have been, since the 1940s. And so this is not, it's not that we're in a time of war in particular. This is just standard day-to-day how we function in this society, right? We are a warlike society, unfortunately. I say that as someone who's come from Britain, which is another warlike society. So the violence abroad means that you get violence domestically, right? When you have an empire like the United States does, like Britain used to have, you require violence to sustain that empire. And that violence that you perpetrate in other places eventually finds its way back home. In modern times, that violence always takes on a racial character. So the British Empire, for example, relied on racist ideology to maintain its authority, both domestically and in colonial settings, particularly when you face resistance to that power, right? So black people and South Asians in Britain who migrated to Britain from the colonies, from the former colonies after the Second World War, encountered the racism that imperialism had fostered there even after the British Empire no longer existed, right? The racism that existed in the periphery came home to the centre, right? Since the end of the Cold War, here in the US, foreign policy planners have regarded the Middle East as the most troublesome territory in, if you like, the US global empire, a region where resistance to that empire seems to be especially strongly felt, particularly against the US's key regional ally, which is Israel. So, following the example of countries like Britain, large sections of the political and cultural elite in the United States have turned to racial ways of explaining resistance around the world, particularly in the Middle East. So, for example, rather than seeing the Palestinian movement as about a struggle for freedom from a military occupation and for human rights, instead it's been more convenient to think that, well, Arabs are just inherently fanatical, so that's what's going on there, right? In other words, the problem is perceived to be their culture, not our politics, right? With the war on terror, that kind of rhetoric is generalized to Muslims as a whole. Their religion seen as somehow especially prone to terrorist violence, right? And when we do that, our own violence of our government, the torture, the drone strikes, the military occupations, can then be more easily defended, right? And don't forget that the war on terrorism kills more civilians than terrorism does, right? We just think that our violence is rational, reasonable, necessary, whereas their violence is fanatical and motivated by hatred, right? So take, for example, someone like Sam Harris, who's one of the so-called new atheist writers who writes about this stuff. Popular writer, someone who has said, for example, Islam is the motherlode of bad ideas, and that we are misled to think the fundamentalists are the fringe. So he says that human rights problems in what he calls the Muslim world are basically caused by Islam, right? So it's a kind of monolith, this religion, that mechanically drives people who believe in it to acts of barbarism. It's kind of standard formula for trying to understand these issues. The problem is that the beliefs that people have reflect the social and political conditions that they're in as much as those beliefs shape those conditions, right? It's a bidirectional relationship between your beliefs and the circumstances, social and political circumstances that you're in. It's not a one-way relationship. And when you look at polls of global public opinion, they suggest that whether one thinks, for example, that violence against civilians is ever legitimate, that has more to do with political context than religious belief, right? So if you're in a situation of political conflict, you're more likely to believe that, irrespective of your religious belief. And violence against civilians happens to be considered more acceptable, according to global public opinion polls. It happens to be considered more acceptable in the United States and in Europe than any other part of the world. And then look further at someone like Sam Harris on these issues. He's written that support of killing civilians, he's written in support of killing civilians for the beliefs that they hold, right? So he has a book called The End of Faith, in which he says, some propositions are so dangerous that it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them, right? This is what the United States attempted in Afghanistan, and it is what we and other Western powers are bound to attempt at an even greater cost to ourselves and to innocents abroad elsewhere in the Muslim world. We will continue to spill blood in what is, at bottom, a war of ideas, right? So in this argument, religious belief becomes a kind of proxy for imminent threat in order to justify wars of aggression against a population that's being defined by its religion, right? Now, the reason that I'm focusing on Sam Harris is because he is not a conservative in any conventional sense. He's not a neoconservative. He is a liberal writer, right? And we need to understand that this kind of thinking that says that these people's ideology is so dangerous that it's okay to kill them, that kind of thinking is as much a feature of liberal thinking on this as it is of conservative thinking, right? And it's precisely the logic of racism throughout the modern era, right? And it's what leads to a situation in which we end up killing more people than the terrorists do, right? You remember earlier this year in February, 3 American Muslim students in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, were shot and killed. Dia Barakat, Yusa Abu Salah, Razan Abu Salah. They're all 19, 21, 23. Those murders were initially ignored by the mainstream media. Large numbers of people had to go on Twitter in order for those murders to get any coverage. There are strong reasons for thinking that the person who carried out the murder was motivated by anti-Muslim animosity of precisely the kind that writers like Sam Harris are circulating, right? Even after that story had become a mainstream news story for a little while, many reports claimed that really it wasn't a racist murder, it was a dispute over parking, right? Absolutely ridiculous claim. But what that also tells us is that there is a possibility of resistance, right? The fact that so many people were able to come on Twitter and change the media narrative here and highlight this particular incidence of violence demonstrates that there's also another America apart from the America of that has this racial history, right? Another America that has taken to the streets with the slogan Black Lives Matter, and that earlier this year amended that and appropriated that to talk about Muslim Lives Matter as well on Twitter. So I think this is the America that has the possibility of overcoming this racial history, but it will only do so if it understands that what we're dealing with here is not a matter of the hatred of a small number of individuals, but a much deeper and longer established system of violence and oppression. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kundnani. I believe we will have time for a few questions. have any questions from the audience? There's one right there.
To Professor Theoharis, the first student that you spoke about, have you ever been able to get into contact with him?
Yeah. So the whole time he was pre-trial, he was under these things called SAMs, and then for the first year and a half after he was after he took the plea, they continued to keep him under SAMs, but then they took the SAMs off, which meant that then we could correspond. And then, interestingly, so I think I mentioned at the end, he was sent to the Supermax in Adiac, in Colorado. It's the most severe federal prison in the system, and it's a very secret federal prison. So, for instance, there are very few pictures of the inside. They've only let in human rights groups once. And part of how they keep out researchers is they say that you have to have a relationship with a prisoner that precedes their crime or precedes what gets them in prison. But interestingly, in Fahad's case, I did. And so I got to go visit him. So this loophole that tends to just preclude almost any researchers or journalists from getting to do stories on people there was a loophole that I was able to use, and so I visited. He's now in the communication management unit in Terre Haute, Indiana. I haven't been there, but I got to go to Colorado twice. So yes, and now we can correspond. So, and once he was moved to Indiana, he was out of solitary confinement. So basically, he spent 3 years pre-trial and about 4.5. So it's an extraordinary amount of time. And again, we're having a bigger conversation in this country, I think, finally, about the inhumanity of solitary confinement and the need to. And we saw that amazing prison hunger strike in California, I think, lead to some real change in California that I think is going to change things. But thank you for that.
I guess my question is, with every presidential debate I've seen, whether it's Democratic or Republican, a question that commonly comes up is like what the president would do to battle ISIS and how they would deal with the conflict that is happening in the Middle East. Do you think these subject matters are contributing to the anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic sentiment in America? And do you think these presidential candidates are contributing to that, or are there any in your eyes that you feel are handling the matters, well?
I think it depends on how those conversations are had. But I don't see a candidate who's just being straightforward and honest about what the situation in the Middle East is. The situation in the Middle East is. We, unfortunately, are dealing with the legacy of a number of foreign policy disasters from the past. ISIS is in part a product of our attempt to invade Iraq in 2003. A lot of the kind of military personnel within ISIS are drawn from Saddam's army. We need to be honest about the past and then face up to the fact that our policy in the Middle East continues to be one of choosing stability through alliances with authoritarian regimes. Historically, the two authoritarian regimes we chose to be in alliance with are Israel and Saudi Arabia. We've now added a third, Iran. If you're interested in opposing religious reactionary ideology in the Middle East, don't be in an alliance with the most religious reactionary state in the region, which is Saudi Arabia, right? But they're our closest ally after Israel, because we we think we need to be in an alliance with them because of oil. In fact, we get most of our oil from Canada now. We should be spending as much time talking about Canada as we do about the Middle East, right? I think that would be the kind of starting point where you could shift the conversation about the Middle East in these presidential debates, and I think that would contribute towards getting away from this idea that there is a very deep-rooted notion that the Middle East is just a place of violence and trouble, right? That we are somehow sucked into, right? But we're the trouble in the Middle East, right?
I mean, I would answer that a slightly different way, which is that I think we get the law enforcement that they perceive we want. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is to kind of make clear that this is not what we want. So I mentioned at the beginning sort of these changes in the law, these material support laws that now criminalize a whole bunch of what, pre-crime, if you will. And I think and then obviously how do you criminalize pre-crime? Well, you have to have theories about who is going to be a pre-criminal. And so you see this kind of widespread surveillance and targeting of certain people. And I think what I didn't say and that I should have said is I think it's easy to kind of then stigmatize, sort of say the problem is the NYPD or the problem is that undercover cop that was spying on those young women. And that's part of the problem. But I think they're going to keep giving us that kind of policing until we say no, right? We're paying for it. This is similar to stop and frisk, right? We paid for that. We paid for all those stops. So I think until the public, I think, makes clear we're going to get the presidential debates we're getting, we're going to get the sort of Islamophobia that's running underneath that I think you're alluding to. So I think part of it is a little bit on us, right, to say this is not the kind of presidential debates we want, this is not the kind of law enforcement we want, we're going to make that known. So.
I think we have time for one more. Last question.
Just a question for Professor Harris. What was the charge for the student in the first case? Because it seemed pretty clear to me that he was not guilty of anything.
So he's facing 4 counts of material support and conspiracy to provide material support. And again, if you'd seen the headlines, right? The headlines originally was military gear to Al-Qaeda. They called him an Al-Qaeda quartermaster, right? Which is obviously a fancy way of saying somebody stayed in your house. So he faced 4 charges if he'd been. So he took a plea on one of them. If he'd gotten, one could argue that was a good decision. If he'd gotten convicted on all 4, it would have carried 70 years. So he got 15 years. Yeah. No, so the penalties I didn't mention that, but sort of with these new material support bans came these extraordinary penalties that a charge of material support to terrorism comes with a huge sentence.
Once again, thank you, Drs. Kundnani and Dr. Theoharis.